You hear that phrase all the time, right? The economy. Politicians, news anchors, they all talk about it like it's this giant, super complicated machine. Well, in this explainer, we're going to pop the hood and see exactly how that machine actually works.
Seriously, it's a word we hear everywhere. On the news, in political debates, even just talking with friends. And it's this huge, kind of abstract thing that somehow affects everything. Our jobs, how much our groceries cost. Everything. So, what is the economy, anyway? That's what we're here to do today. We're going to break it all down and really build a solid foundation for understanding the big forces that shape our world.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to tackle this in 5 parts. First, we'll get the big picture. Then, we'll look at the engine that drives most economies, capitalism. After that, we'll see how we actually measure all this with something called GDP. Then, we'll get into stuff you feel every day, inflation and unemployment. And we'll wrap up by looking at one of the biggest challenges out there, inequality.
All right, let's jump right in with Section 1, the big picture. Before we get into all the details, we got to understand the scale we're even talking about here. So, economics is usually split into 2 big fields. And fun fact, both terms were coined by the same guy, Ragnar Frisch, way back in 1933. First, you've got microeconomics. Think of this as studying the individual trees, looking at the decisions of a single person or one specific company. But what we're diving into today is macroeconomics. This is where we zoom out and look at the entire forest. We're talking about the huge, sweeping forces like interest rates, national productivity, and unemployment, the stuff that affects literally everyone.
Okay, so if macro is the study of the whole forest, we kind of need to know what kind of forest are we in. To really get it, we have to understand its operating system, so to speak. And for most modern economies, that operating system is capitalism.
So what even is capitalism? It sounds super complex, right? But at its heart, it really just boils down to a system built on 3 main pillars: private property, markets, and firms. Let's take a quick look at what each of those really means.
Okay, let's break them down. Private property? That's just a fancy way of saying you have the right to own your stuff. Simple. Markets? Well, those are just the places, whether it's a farmer's market or the internet, where we all go to trade things back and forth. And firms? Those are the businesses, the companies that take inputs like workers and raw materials and turn them into products to sell in those markets, all with the goal of making a profit.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. When you put those 3 things together, private property, markets, and firms, something incredible happens. It's what economists call the capitalist revolution. Suddenly, you have this powerful reason to innovate. If you own your idea, you can sell it in a market. And firms are always competing, pushing each other to be better and more efficient. This combo, this simple recipe, is what unleashed the mind-blowing technological progress and economic growth we've seen over the last couple of centuries.
So if capitalism is the engine, how do we know how fast it's going? How can we tell if the economy is actually growing or if it's shrinking? Well, for that, you need a speedometer. And the main speedometer that economists use is called GDP.
Yeah, gross domestic product, or GDP. It sounds super technical, but the idea is actually pretty straightforward. It's the market value, so the price tag, of all the final goods and services. And final is important. It means we only count the finished car, not the tires and the engine separately, so we don't double count. And all of this has to be produced inside a country's borders over the course of 1 year.
And what's really cool about this is how it all connects. You can actually measure GDP in 3 different ways. You can add up all the spending, or you can add up all the income people earned, or you can add up all the value that was created at each step. And here's the magic trick. In a perfect world, all 3 of those methods should give you the exact same number. Why? Because every single dollar somebody spends becomes income for somebody else. It's a perfect circle.
But hold on a second. This brings up a huge problem. If we're just measuring the value of stuff based on prices, what happens if the prices themselves change? Just think about it. What if we make the exact same number of cars as last year, but the price of every car doubles? The GDP number would go way up, making it look like the economy boomed. But did it? Really? Did we actually produce more?
And that's why we have to talk about 2 different kinds of GDP. There's nominal GDP, which uses today's prices. The problem is it can be really misleading because it goes up if we produce more stuff or if prices just go up. So the real hero of our story is real GDP. Real GDP is the one that adjusts for inflation. It uses prices from a fixed base year in the past, which lets us strip away the effects of price changes and see if we actually produced more stuff.
Let's make this super clear with an example. Look at this table. In 2011, both the prices and the number of things we made went up. So if you look at nominal GDP, it looks like the economy just exploded, right? It shot up to over 106 million. But if we calculate real GDP using the original 2010 prices, we see the real story. The actual growth in stuff we produced was to 84 million. That's a huge difference. Real GDP is the number that tells us what's actually going on.
Okay, but does a higher real GDP mean everyone's life is better? Well, this is where it gets complicated. GDP is a fantastic tool, but it's got some serious blind spots. It tells you nothing about how that money is distributed. That's inequality. It doesn't value things like leisure time or, say, clean air. And here's a really weird one. Stuff like a hurricane or a crime wave can actually make GDP go up. Why? Because of all the spending on rebuilding and security. So it's a measure of economic activity for sure, but not necessarily a measure of well-being. And that whole idea of well-being leads us perfectly into our next section. We're going to talk about two numbers that probably affect our day-to-day lives more than anything else: inflation and unemployment. This is the stuff we really feel. We've already talked a little about inflation. The official definition is just the rate at which prices in general are going up. But let's be real, what it actually means is that the money in your wallet buys less than it used to. Your purchasing power gets eaten away. So how do we even measure this? Well, there are two main ways. One is called the GDP deflator, and it looks at the prices of absolutely everything produced in a country. But the one you probably hear about all the time on the news is the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. That one's a bit different. It tracks the price of a fixed basket of stuff that a typical family buys. Things like milk, gas, rent, that kind of thing. Now, you might be thinking, wouldn't the perfect inflation rate be just zero? And that makes sense. But surprisingly, most economists would tell you no. Of course, super high inflation is terrible, but a little bit of it, like a slow, steady increase, can actually be good for the economy. It kind of greases the wheels. The real boogeyman is when prices start falling. That's called deflation. And it sounds great, but it can completely paralyze an economy, because why would you buy something today if it's going to be cheaper tomorrow?
Okay, let's switch gears to the other big one, unemployment. Now, the official definition is actually pretty specific about who counts. You start with the whole population, right? Then you take out people who can't work or aren't expected to, like kids or retirees. What you're left with is the civilian labor force, and that's the key group. It's made up of people who either have a job or are actively looking for one. So to be officially unemployed, you have to be in that labor force, actively looking, but just don't have a job right now. All right, so this is where we bring everything together. We're going to talk about one of the biggest, most difficult challenges in any modern economy: inequality. We've established that this system is an incredible engine for creating wealth. But the big question is, how is all that wealth being shared? And what happens when it isn't?
And a massive piece of this puzzle today is technology. This quote really just nails it. Automation increases demand for some skills and reduces demand for others. That's it in a nutshell. Technology isn't this neutral force, it's a double-edged sword. It creates amazing new opportunities for some while making other jobs just disappear.
So how does this actually play out? Well, first, machines are getting really good at routine, predictable jobs. That can push a lot of people out of work. At the same exact time, if you have skills that work with the new technology, if you're a software developer or a data scientist, for example, your skills become way more valuable and your salary can go through the roof. And the third piece of this is that when machines do more of the work, more of the money, more of the profits goes to the people who own the machines, what economists call capital, instead of to the people doing the labor.
And that brings us right to the fundamental dilemma at the heart of macroeconomics today. We have this system that is, without a doubt, an incredible engine for creating wealth. We can measure it with tools like real GDP. But we're also seeing how that very same engine, especially when it's supercharged by technology, can also create massive gaps in society. And so it leaves us with the big, open-ended question for our time. What do we do about it? How do we manage this trade-off? How do we keep the engine of innovation running, but also make sure that the prosperity it creates is shared by everyone?